This time would be different, I thought. But there I was, broke, jobless, in the middle of nowhere and living in a really scary and haunted house. The last thing in the world I wanted. It all started when I decided to make another attempt to get out of the big city once and for all. I hate big cities, but I always ended up in one to be able to support myself financially. This is an honest and true story about the haunted house I ended up in. It was isolated from the world, and the nearest neighbor was more than 3 miles away. It was the beginning of summer, and I was anxious to get out of Greater Sao Paulo again. Finally, after looking everywhere, I got a job as a radio technician in a small town in the interior of Sao Paulo. The town was about 30 miles from the almost uninhabited valley where I hoped to live again. I went to the radio station as soon as I arrived in the small town, and after introductions and hearing what was expected of me in the service, I went to my favorite valley. Everything was rosy, at least at first. I had some friends in the valley from when I had lived there before, so I figured I could stay with them until I found a place of my own. After 2 weeks, things weren't going so well at the radio station. They had changed their minds about having a full-time technician there. However, that didn't put an end to my hopes of getting a good job somewhere else and staying in the area. I had looked at several houses for rent, but none of them really suited me. Finally, one day, I saw an old friend Beto and his newlywed wife. He was also looking for a place to rent and had some ideas that I hadn't thought of. There was one place he described to me that sounded wonderful. It was an old 2-story, 6-bedroom farmhouse, complete with barns and stables. The house was 15 kilometers from the nearest town and was reached by a road that was rarely used. The rent at the time was $75 per month. The owner had lowered the rent on the house in exchange for renovations, according to Bob. I was starting to get excited until his dear wife added that the house was haunted. Since it was the first time I had met Bob's wife, I didn't know what to think. Bob wasn't the least bit superstitious, and judging by what I had heard about his wife, she wasn't either. Still, I decided to go see the house. Maybe she didn't like old houses that needed renovation. I managed to get to the house in the early afternoon. It was a warm summer, and the fresh air and the mountains in the distance gave the house a very appealing look. I could see the barn and other buildings along the grounds. As I approached the front door, I noticed that most of the wood was rotten and had fallen over the years, making the porch impassable. Then I remembered that Bob had told me to enter through the back entrance of the house. I went back and entered the kitchen, thinking how nice it would be to live in a farmhouse. Inside, I was greeted by the sound of a leaking faucet. I went to the sink and tried, in vain, to turn off the faucet. This only made things worse. More water started coming out, so I decided to let it go and continue with my visit. The kitchen was gigantic, the size of many living rooms, with a very high ceiling, with large cabinets with glass doors. After looking at the kitchen and the cold pantry with an entrance on the side of the kitchen, I continued on to the living room. The living room must have been twice as big as the kitchen, with an equally high ceiling. I was getting more and more excited. Leaving the living room, I entered a hallway that led to the front of the house. On the left side of the hallway was the only bathroom in the house. Continuing down the hallway were 4 bedrooms, 3 of which had windows that faced the front of the house. 2 of them had doors to the outside of the house that led to the porch. I was getting more and more anxious about living in that house the more I looked at it. So much so that I had even forgotten the comment Beto's wife had made. After taking the tour of the lower part of the house, I went up to see the upper floor. The house had originally been built with 4 bedrooms and a bathroom. The kitchen, living room, and the upper part, which took up half of the house, had been built later. The stairs led to a hallway that ran from one end of the upper part of the house to the other. On the left of the hallway, there was a small room, a storage room, with construction materials and some scraps of wood. To the right, there was a door that led to a bedroom with a door, doorknobs, window, chandeliers, all in an old colonial style. I was thinking that it was a wonderful house. Now I was heading towards the other bedroom at the end of the hallway, which had the door closed. When I opened the door and walked in, I noticed that the room had been recently renovated with wallpaper and everything. And then it finally began. Almost immediately when I walked into the room, I didn't feel very comfortable. It felt like my head had stopped working. Just a few moments of looking at the house. It seemed like a dream come true. But as soon as I walked into the room, I felt nothing. I just felt like someone was looking at me from my right, which was the front of the house. I turned in that direction and noticed that a hole had been cut in the wall near the floor and was covered by a plastic bag taped to the wall. It was probably the entrance to the crawl space of the original part of the house. I walked over to the hole and removed the plastic so I could look inside. Maybe it was because my eyes weren't adjusted to the darkness, but I had the impression that I saw a pair of eyes looking at me from the darkness. Then came the noises, cracking in the wood, as if someone was coming towards me from the crawl space very slowly. I felt a strange sensation, but it seemed like nothing was moving inside, except that the eyes were no longer there. I stuck my head in and looked from side to side, but all I could see were shadows of the wood of the structure. I decided it was just my imagination, so I put the plastic back in place and turned to leave. But I just couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched as I left the room. I opened the door, walked out, and closed the door behind me. As I walked down the stairs, I tried to forget that strange feeling I had felt in the room. Once again, I was enchanted by the place. I went to the kitchen and left the house, and walked about 30 meters away from the house, and took a good look around, thinking how nice it would be to live in a place like that. Suddenly I felt like I was being watched again. I looked in the direction where the impression was coming from, and it was right in an air vent that was on the side of the house where the ceiling of the original part of the house was. I couldn't shake that feeling, no matter how hard I tried. After I got back to the city, I forgot about the weird part of the visit and could only think about the good things and how much I liked the place. But I really didn't feel like moving there alone, so I put it aside for a while. A few days later, I got a phone call telling me that my brother and a friend of his were coming to visit me. I knew my brother wanted to get out of the city, as much as I did. He had always talked about moving to the country to live with me. When he arrived, he told me that his friend, and he wanted to stay with me for the summer. Finally, it was my chance to move into the house I had seen. My brother agreed to split the rent with me after I told him about the place. We talked to the owner of the house and then moved my furniture, which had been in storage since my last attempt to live in the area, into the house. I chose one of the downstairs bedrooms next to the bathroom. The first night was pretty quiet. After the third day, after not finding any jobs, my brother and his friend told me they were leaving to go back to the capital. So there I was, living alone in a gigantic, potentially haunted house. The noises usually happened around 11 p.m. At first I just heard something scratching on the walls. I thought it might be rats. After a few days, I started hearing loud footsteps upstairs. It was like someone was dragging something around that strange room upstairs. I remember putting my ear against the wall to see if the noise was really coming from the house, and it was. Since I had a stereo, I would simply turn the volume up high enough to not hear the footsteps coming from the second floor. I usually stayed awake until I couldn't sleep any longer, usually between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m. This was the norm every night. After several weeks of living like this, I went to talk to a friend, Diogo, from Sao Paulo, who was also trying to escape the big city. Since he was looking for a place to stay, I offered him one of my rooms. Diogo accepted right away. With 5 rooms to choose from, he chose one that was on the ground floor near the stairs at the front of the house. The next morning, Diogo asked me something very interesting. What I was doing walking back and forth upstairs the night before. I told him that I hadn't gone up there the night before. He didn't believe me and said that I had been walking around in the room above his room. But I told him that there was nothing above his room, just a ceiling, After showing the upstairs floor, I finally convinced him. Now he had come to the same conclusion as me. There was a ghost up there. So, in a strange way of trying to comfort me, Tara, I think, he told me about an experience that I'll tell you about another time. Diogo stayed in my haunted house for 2 weeks. Then he took off, leaving me alone to be eaten by whatever was crawling on the second floor. Some time later, I ended up running into a friend in town. She asked me how I was and where I was living. When I told her, her comment was, "Oh, that house is haunted." So she told me the story of the house. She said that a family had moved into the house some time ago, and one of the tenants' sons occupied the front bedroom on the second floor. He started doing seances, glass games, and things like that. A lot of bad things started happening to the family, and after a short time, they ended up moving out. She said that the state they were in emotionally was very precarious. They were just a shadow of what they had been. They were tired and depressed. When I got home, I wasn't sure if I liked hearing this extra information about the house. A few nights later, there was so much noise upstairs. It was such a mess. It sounded like whatever was causing the mess was going to come down the stairs. I was so scared that I was already making plans about which window to jump out of and which clothes to take. Not even the stereo could mask the noise anymore. However, nothing materialized that night. If I put everything that happened to me while I was there, it would take up a lot of space. However, there was one night that I will never forget. The only phone jack in the house was in the living room, which was below that bedroom. That night, I was waiting for a phone call from some friends who were about to arrive. I waited all day for the call. That night, after 11 p.m., the noises eventually started. I had settled into bed to survive the night as usual when the phone started ringing. The sound of the phone startled me, to say the least. The sound was barely audible due to the noise from the bedroom above the living room. I got up and went into the dark hallway and turned on the light. When I got to the living room, where I always left a light on at night, I answered the phone. It was indeed my friends calling. I tried to sound calm, but the whole time I was on the phone, I could hear footsteps in the room above me. Every second I expected to see something running down the stairs, but nothing happened. Even my friend on the phone realized that something was wrong. As expected, I never got a steady job, so I was forced to move, guess where to? Yes, back to Sao Paulo. I put all my furniture in one of the front rooms, with the permission of the owner of the house, and left from there. After several months, when I went back to get my things, I asked the current tenant if he liked the house. He was a former police officer. He told me he liked the house. It took him a while to trust me and open up. He eventually told me that one night he heard a noise upstairs and saw that someone had obviously broken into the house, into the front bedroom, and was practically destroying it, although it would be almost impossible for someone to climb a smooth wall and get in through the second-floor window. He told me he grabbed his flashlight, his loaded gun, and went upstairs to see who it was. As soon as he opened the door, the noise stopped. He looked around the empty room, with the window closed and locked from the inside. So he went to look through the hole in the ceiling. He went inside and looked from one end to the other and saw nothing. As soon as he went back to the room and looked around again, he came to the same conclusion I had when I moved in. He then told me that one night, it was late, he was watching TV in the living room, and he and his wife saw an apparition, a mist with the shape of a person, but nothing very clear, come down the stairs, past them, go towards the front of the house, and enter one of the bedrooms. He went to look at the bedroom later, but saw nothing. I only went back there one more time later, 2 years later. After telling the story to some friends in the car while we were passing through the valley, we went to one of the towns that were there, stopped at a supermarket to buy food, and went to see the house. It had just gotten dark. When we arrived, we went to the back door, and I saw that no one was home. One of the people who were with us was a religious woman, and she put her hand on the door and began to pray. We all heard when the dishes, pots, and the kitchen table began to vibrate and shake. Then it was the windows and the door that began to shake along with the rest that was already shaking. We ran back to the car. When we got there, there was a strange substance bait on the car door handle that hadn't been there when we pulled into town just a few minutes ago. Needless to say, I never went near that house again.